Hello, favorite students of mine. Welcome to Class 2, Individuals and Families. We're going to spend some time talking today about the class assignment readings, chapters 3 and 4. We're going to spend some time doing an overview of the helping process. We're also going to spend some time looking at cardinal social work values. So some of this, again, will be repeat, but again, we want to make sure that you understand um, the significance of these particular concepts as you move forward in terms of learning what you need to know to become the best social worker that you can actually be. So with that said, let's switch to our presentation for today. So we're going to do an overview of the helping process. And so what we plan, or what the idea is by the time you've done your classroom readings, listened to this lecture, and participated in the in-class exercises, you will be able to do the following. You should be able to actually identify the steps in the helping process from exploration through implementation and termination. Also, to plan and structure your environment for your interviews in the first chapter's readings. And then in the second chapter, we're going to be looking at operationalizing the cardinal social work values. So really having a better understanding about ethical dilemmas, the role that the NASW codes play in that, self-awareness and professional competence, um, as well as understanding some of the complexities around applying ethical standards when your clients are actually minors. So we're going to spend a little bit of time just kind of doing an overview of all of these particular things as we kind of move through the process. The helping process. So in social work, we're looking at these particular three phases. We're going to spend time dealing with exploration, engagement, assessment, and planning, the implementation and goal attainment, and then finally termination. So it really sets the tone and the structure for how we move forward in our work with our clients. So when we talk about the first phase, we talk about exploration and engagement. We're really looking at exploration of the problem. We're looking at things like establishing a rapport, as well as looking at this multi-dimensional assessment, negotiating those goals, and then starting to make some of the referrals. So things to keep in mind as you are in this particular process of this particular phase. You want to make sure that you understand the importance of gathering data from your client about the problem, as well as any environmental factors, so what's going on in their own living environment. Recognizing that when people come in the door for services, whether they're compelled or whether they're coming of their own volition, that there is some nervousness, there's some apprehension about what services you'll be able to provide, whether it's a good fit or the whole 9 yards. So recognize that the person often that's sitting there in front of you, or that family that you're working with, has some reservations, has some very real fears, and you'll probably see some of those initially on in the start of this particular process. So just to be aware of that. And your job at that point really is to look at establishing a rapport with that client, as well as gathering information about the problem situation from their standpoint, and just recognize that's a part of it. So, an example is that you'll probably have them fill out intake forms, but also making sure that in addition to those intake forms, asking questions like, so what brings you here today, and how can we help you? So really wanting to make sure that people understand why it is you're there, and what's going on. I think you also, as a social worker, should give a brief description, an overview, and the purpose of the first contact. So really sitting down and explaining to your clients what your agency does, what they attempt to do, what this first meeting is about, to really kind of resolve some of that anxiety in terms of that. And then as you move on towards building rapport, you're wanting to establish some trust with clients. Wanting them to, you also need to take into account cultural factors, and use the interviewing techniques that are relevant for any particular culture. Um, and keep in mind that clients will draw a conclusion about the openness of the agency based on often that first visit. So it's very important to understand that. So you're wanting to spend some time attempting to help potential clients understand what the problem is from their vantage point as well as yours, and what the concerns are, and to neutralize any negative feelings that they actually might be having as well. So as we keep moving forward, we can think about the multidimensional assessment. So, if you're able to demonstrate empathy and you're working with your clients, and pay attention to those communication skills, the problem exploration, which is a critical part, will be a little bit easier to get at in terms of clients feeling safe enough to actually share information about what might be happening with them in terms of why they're in need of help. Also recognizing that during the interview, social workers need to weigh the significance of the client's behaviors, thoughts, and emotions. So paying attention to what's happening in the room as addition to what they're saying to you about what's happening in their environments is also an important process to learn. We'll talk more about that as you move towards your interviewing process. Analyze the problem and identify the factors that contribute to the difficulties or things that you want to do in this process as well as looking at kind of the individual, the client's needs, wants, their capacities to cope, their strengths and their limitations, and their motivation to work on the problem. So these are all things that you will need to be able to do before you get to negotiating those goals. So once there's a clear understanding about what the issues are, how they can potentially be resolved, what resources you're able to apply, then it's about negotiating what that means. So if you're looking at a service, for example, that might involve people coming to the house to do some of the administration of some of those services, is that's going to be something that's comfortable for that client. You need to take into consideration their living environment, who's living with them. All of those kind of things play a role in terms of being a part of that negotiation discussion with your clients about the types of services that they need. And once you're able to do that, then moving forward with making those referrals. Also, phase 2 moves into the implementation and goal attainment. So really looking at factors around self-efficacy. What can people do to actually help themselves? Putting together plans about how we're going to monitor progress. Identifying what those barriers and goals are to the accomplishment. And relational reactions. Enhancing client self-awareness as well as use of self. So let me give you an example of what some of this may look like. So if I'll go back to a social worker, child protection social worker, formerly which I was. And so after I've sat down, we've had the conversation about the issues that bring this into the attention of the agency. I also want to explore from the client's perspective about what's going on. They give me the issues because often abuse and neglect is symptomatic of other functioning issues within the context of the family. So after we've established that and they recognize that I'm here to actually help assist them in terms of alleviating those kinds of conditions, we need to sit down and talk about goals. So if I've got a younger parent or an older parent who actually has had some difficulty in terms of being able to parent their own children, and as a result the children are behaving in ways that cause them to be unsafe in the community or in a school, then one of the goals that we might agree upon might be the need for parenting education. So how do you actually parent these particular kids of yours? And so we might negotiate what that might look like. Am I going to send you to, or are we going to go to a center where you actually go and meet in a group setting with other parents who are learning about parenting, or do you want the individualized attention and having a service provider come to your home? So things like that are things that I want to do. And the goal accomplishments, what are those barriers? What's going to be barriers? Do you work during the day? Do you have transportation to get to a center if that's need be? Are your work hours conducive with the service provider so that I can set up a time where they can come to your home after you're able to be off work? Those are the kind of things that you're looking at when you're looking at goal attainment and monitoring progress. And then use of self. Typically, how people see you in terms of how user-friendly that you may be as a social worker in terms of being able to acknowledge some of the struggles that they have. I would typically say to parents that my being here as a child protection social worker is not an indictment that you're a bad parent. Um, Children are 24-hour day, 7-day a week, lifetime commitment that come with no instructions. And so you need to understand that I'm not here to judge you, not here to, to reinforce that you're a bad parent. I believe that you love your children, and I want to help you be able to parent them in a way that they can be more successful. So examples like that would be a good indication of how one would use themselves in this process. And then finally, after we have moved through the process, we've identified the goals, we've established a rapport, we've got a plan in place, we've made referrals, we've been monitoring the progress, we're going to look at termination. So at what point do we feel that sufficient goals have been attained to actually resolve the actual problem situation? And that can be something that can be decided mutually with you and your client. And then we're also looking at strategies for them to be able to maintain the degrees of success that they have accomplished even after you're gone. So really looking at those maintenance strategies, what other resources can you be involved in after parenting education is gone? Are there other relatives, friends, neighbors who can assist you in terms of raising and taking care of the children? Those are the kind of things that you want to think about when you're looking at the termination phase when you're working with clients. Now, if we switch gears and move on to the interview process, recognizing that these are things that are going to be very important in terms of preparing for that interview. So where you're going to actually conduct the interview, so the physical conditions, what's actually in the room makes a huge difference oftentimes. So make sure that you pay attention to those kinds of things as you are connecting with clients. Most larger agencies will actually have separate interview rooms that address many of these particular physical conditions and factors. The other thing, again, you want to do, as always, as we just talked about in terms of that process, is even during your interview process, is about establishing that rapport. We often hear the comment of starting where the client actually is, and so that's a very important place. Not judging what they bring to the table, really kind of meeting them where they are and to help really understand what's happening for them. Being aware of those cultural norms and biases, so who's sitting in the room with you. If there's a language issue, there might be a need for an interpreter, which adds another dynamic to the interview process that might even lengthen it over time for the translation to actually take place. Paraphrasing, giving people back information that you thought you heard them say, exploring with the expectations and eliciting that information is all a part of that interviewing process. Also, you're going to want to start to do some focusing in depth. You're going to be looking at things like emotional functioning, cognitive functioning. Some of these things will become apparent as you're sitting actually in the interview with your clients about how they're responding to information, what's a typical response to this type of news, and how does your client kind of line up along that? Are they tracking what it is you're saying? Are they able to understand and comprehend? Exploring substance abuse, violence in the home, poverty, income, housing, things of that particular nature also play a role in terms of what you need to do for the interview process. Negotiating those goals in a contract form, and then ending the interview and looking at goal attainment are the other parts of that particular interview process that you want to participate in. All right, we're going to switch gears. We're going to spend some time looking at some of the components that were laid out for our learning in Chapter 4, operationalizing the cardinal social work values. So let's see what those values actually are and what it is we should be doing. So the National Association of Social Workers core values, the NASW core values that really guide our work are as follows. We recognize that all human beings deserve access to the resources they need to deal with their life's problems and develop their fullest potential. So you can see how inclusive that core value is. It doesn't discriminate against people who don't speak the language. It doesn't discriminate based on a person's sexuality or their race or their religion. It doesn't discriminate on all those things. It says all human beings deserve those things. And so it is our job and it's our goal and it's a part of our values to make sure that whomever we encounter, that we actually be able to be open to embrace them, to actually make sure that we're meeting the core values of our mission. We recognize and meet people where they are. We recognize the individual worth and dignity in every human being. And recognizing that sometimes this might be a challenge and it might cause you to stretch. In my own professional career, I've worked with a number of different client populations, and I remember probably one of my most difficult populations that I worked with was I worked with adult sex offenders who had been released from prison. And so again, what I had to recognize is that even though this person had been involved in some very heinous activity and presented a danger to society at one particular point in time, is that even beyond that, they were still human beings and that they still deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, irregardless of the behavior that they had been involved in the past. So again, when you're thinking about those core value pieces around dignity and respect, it applies universally to all the people that we connect with. Those core values also means that you as a social worker have to operate in a trustworthy manner. You've got to be ethical in terms of what you do. You've got to represent yourself appropriately. You can't misrepresent yourself. And you also need to treat your fellow professionals with respect. So again, it's about a part of our conduct in terms of how we do our things. We have to do things in a trustworthy, above board way. We're also required to practice within the scope of our knowledge and ability. Huge, huge, huge. Social workers tend to oftentimes think that in the capacity of the work that they do, that they need to save and fix everything. And that's a part of what we do. But within limits of understanding what it is we have expertise in and what it is we don't. I have expertise in social service management and in child welfare case management and investigation. I'm comfortable providing information and working in those particular settings. However, I'm less comfortable working in a clinical setting where I'm looking at folks who have mental health diagnoses and I'm actually looking at counseling and therapy or providing those services. That's beyond the scope of my practice. So I would defer clients who have those kinds of issues to folks who have more appropriate scope of knowledge. And so for me to practice or to actually try and provide services in a very extensive way for folks who've got those kind of diagnoses is me practicing above and outside of my scope of knowledge and ability. And that's problematic. So these are other things that you need to keep in mind in terms of the things listed here in blue around how you also still acknowledge those things. Embracing and challenging challenges in embracing the profession's values. So recognizing that you're going to be in agencies, you're going to be working in field situations, you're going to be working in courts. There'll be any number of situations that you will find yourself in as you embrace this work. So you have to be real clear about understanding and embracing the profession's values. And if you're not able to, there's some things that you can do for yourself in terms of looking at supervision, making sure that you're not in a case that's going to be problematic for you, recognizing those cultural norms, and practicing moderate universalism. Those are all things that could be challenges, but things that you need to be aware of. So when we think about ethics, we're talking about law and ethics, about doing the right thing. It's about self-determination. It's about making sure that people have informed consent. So I'm gathering this information from you to provide service for you, but you have the right to know what I'm going to do with that information, who has access to that information, who does not have access to that information, how we plan to use it, and under what conditions we release that information. Preserving professional boundaries. And so recognizing that I'm a professional and in the work relationship, I'm always seen as the one, or in the relationship period, I'm always seen as the one with the power. So I have the responsibility to make sure that things are done the right way, as well as making sure that client confidentiality is maintained. When we think about the relationship of law and ethics, again, you've got laws that dictate and tell us what we need to do as it relates to how we practice. You'll see some of those laws and statutes actually at the Board of Social Work site, where there are actual Minnesota statutes that talk about what it is we do and how we do it and what we don't do. And then there's also ethical obligations. So based on the values that we work in terms of as social workers, recognizing where those particular pieces intersect. And so there's some principles like the ones that are listed here, which are simply just situations that never should arise or we should never find ourselves in. There are some limits to confidentiality. And so what we would suggest and recommend is that people always do the supervision and the consultation. You're able to obtain waivers from clients. You have a duty to share information when or confidentiality can be compromised when you've got situations where there's a danger to self or others, where there's suspicion of child abuse or elder abuse. You've also got subpoenas. There will be sometimes where you will be actually mandated by courts to provide information about what your work with a client has been, and that's under a court order, as well as privileged communication really fits along the same pieces. And then there's confidentiality in terms of recording pieces. So there are a couple of things that I wanted to share with you as it relates to this whole notion of ethical dilemmas and resolving some of those. The right to life, health, and well-being, the necessity of life takes precedence over confidentiality. So know that. An individual's basic right to well-being takes precedence over another rights to privacy and freedom. So if I'm working with a client and we're in a therapeutic relationship and they disclose to me that they're angry with their wife, and when they leave my office that they're going to go home and they're going to physically assault them, then that well-being for that individual's basic right, the wife in this particular instance, trumps confidentiality. So I have a duty to warn and to make sure that I take steps to make sure that this spouse is protected from abuse. My knowing this information and failing to act on it results in consequences for me, and it's unethical behavior. So that's just an example of some of the things. A person's right to self-determination takes precedence over his or her right to well-being. So your client can say no. They have the ability to do that if they so see fit and they choose to do so. A person's right for well-being may override laws, policies, and arrangements of the organization. So again, making sure that you're in good consultation when you're finding yourself in difficult situations. Ethics in terms of practice with minors. Minors' rights are limited by laws and policies, make differences in maturity and decision-making capacities. Parents may retain their rights to review a child's treatment record and be informed of issues that are raised in therapy. So again, working with a child, working with a minor, working with someone under 18, there's a different set of standards in that the rights of the parents are still at play in most instances, and they have the ability, and we have an obligation to share those things. And the rights are dependent on the particular services presenting substance abuse treatment, sexually transmitted diseases, things of that nature. So a little bit of a different twist when you're looking at working with minors. Understanding and, again, resolving those ethical dilemmas. We just talked about some of those just a moment ago when I gave you some examples. So this basically just kind of reiterates that comment, those comments. And then steps of ethical decision making. So these are the things that you want to work through as you find yourself in an ethical dilemma, as you are working with a situation where there's a need to respond, and that particular response will create difficulties potentially for a client and or for an agency or both, but a decision has to be made. So these are the things that you would utilize in terms of decision-making steps in conjunction with your NASW coach to actually help you think about how you come to a reasonable conclusion and resolve those kinds of circumstances. So with that, this would actually wrap up our work for today in terms of the overviewing of the helping process as well as the cardinal social work values. So I again encourage you to do your course readings and to look through and to be prepared for a review once we do get to class and your in-class exercises as well. So I will see you in class.